Thank you very much, Martijn, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for the opportunity. Are we audible in Bogota, Medellin, Cali?
Yes, I
okay,
do.
Great. Okay, great. So obviously, we will give a short presentation about the convention that we have signed with Colombia. It speaks for itself that 20 minutes, half an hour will be by far too short to discuss all the details of the treaty, and maybe many of you won't be specialists on tax issues and may not be interested in the details. So we'll make a broad presentation of the convention. But before that, and with your permission, Mr. Ambassador and Martijn, I will turn to English, to Spanish for a minute to introduce ourselves and to thank the audience. So, buenos días a todos en Bogotá, en Medellín, en Cali, en toda Colombia. Gracias a nuestros compañeros de la Holland House y gracias al señor embajador y los compañeros de la embajada por la invitación y la posibilidad de presentar y explicar el convenio en esta ocasión. También quisiera desde aquí, aunque no están presentes en esta reunión, agradecer a nuestros compañeros de la DIAN y del Ministerio de Hacienda en Colombia por todas las conversaciones útiles y constructivas que tuvimos durante las negociaciones que tomaron, bueno, hay que ser franco, francamente, comenzamos en el 2008, así que en 13 años tuvimos 4 ruedas, las últimas 3 yo estuve presente y fue un verdadero placer cooperar con los compañeros de la DIAN y del Ministerio de Hacienda. Finalmente, gracias a todos ustedes, los participantes, por su interés en el tema. Creemos que la cantidad de participantes demuestra claramente la importancia que tiene este convenio para tantas empresas. Estamos convencidos que el convenio contribuirá a la profundización de la relación económica entre nuestros países, como el embajador dijo, ya son bastante fuertes, pero esperamos que con este convenio podemos contribuir a una mejor relación económica. Y por supuesto, esperamos finalmente que esta presentación contribuya al mejor entendimiento de lo que significa el convenio. Con eso dicho, volvemos al inglés. As I was saying in Spanish, thank you to our colleagues at the Holland House and at the Embassy for the opportunity to present the contents of this convention, which we are sure will contribute to a further improvement of the economic relation between our countries. So, Martijn or Laura, I don't know who is handling the PowerPoint. If you could move to the next slide, please. Yes. So here again on the left side, we see Presidente Duque and Prime Minister Rutte and the signature of the convention on the left, and on the right side, the aspects that we will try to deal with today. I will start with some general aspects about the process and other issues. I will say something about the cooperation between the tax administration of both countries under the convention, and some very short words about what the convention implies for individuals. And then my colleague Paul will take over and present to you what maybe many of you will find the most interesting part of the presentation, namely what are the consequences of the convention for business profits. If you could move to the next slide, please. This is the process. The red part has finished. We have spent, as I said in Spanish, 4 rounds of negotiations, 2 in Bogota, 2 here in Den Haag, with our colleagues from Colombia. We have reached agreement in 2020. The signature was postponed for many times, but is now there. The signature means that the governments agree. It doesn't say anything about parliament. So we have agreement between the officials at our level. We have agreement between the governments, but now we need agreement and confirmation from parliament. So it's entering the parliamentary process, and as soon as that is finished in both countries, it is the moment for ratification. Documents are exchanged, and then after that, that's a technical issue explained in the convention. The convention will enter into force. The ambassador said it could take 2, maybe more years. We are still slightly hopeful that we can finalize the process in 2022, at least on our side. It's hard for us to predict what will happen in Colombia, but we have some hope that we might finalize the process, parliamentary process, in 2022 here, and that the treaty might enter into effect on the 1st of January 2023. Nothing promised, nothing sure, but we will try to achieve that as hard as we can. And if we could move to the next slide, please, Laura. So two general aspects. Which taxes are covered under the convention? Here, there are two aspects to it, as I haven't said yet, but the treaties are always referred to as treaties for the elimination of double tax. But over the last 10 years, I think the other aspect of conventions has become more and more important in international relations, and that is the prevention of avoidance of tax. So the elimination of double taxation, in that aspect, the convention only applies to income taxes for individuals and corporate income. But where it comes to avoidance of tax, the convention applies to all taxes. So the Dutch and the Colombian tax authorities cooperate to eliminate avoidance of tax on all possible taxes. And then there's always, many of you will not be aware, but the structure of the Kingdom of the Netherlands is rather complicated. We have a Caribbean part of the kingdom, but we have agreed with our colleagues from Colombia that the treaty will only apply to the European part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands and only to taxes levied in that part of the kingdom. Next slide, please. So this cooperation between tax administration, what does it entitle? First of all, and I think that's an important part for businesses in particular, but also for individuals, is that the tax authorities have agreed that if a taxpayer is of the opinion that he has not been treated in conformity with the tax convention, he can start a mutual, or he can ask for a mutual agreement procedures in which the competent authorities of both states try to relieve double taxation as is meant by the convention, but maybe not properly applied by the administrations. The second part of exchange of cooperation between the authorities, with which maybe some taxpayers may not be that happy, is that we have enhanced the exchange of information. We have made agreements in the convention that any information needed at the other side on the tax administration will be delivered by the state that has that information. Also, we have agreed that we will assist each other in the collection of taxes. If a Dutch taxpayer leaves the country with tax debts to be paid and he goes to Colombia, the Colombian tax administration has assured us that they will help us in collecting this tax. And finally, and maybe that's a bit odd issue to discuss under the cooperation between the tax administrations, but the tax convention includes some important parts in Article 25 on anti-abuse provisions. And if we could move to the next slide. The anti-abuse provision consists of what we technically call a limitation on benefits. So the benefits of the treaty are only available to certain, as we call them, qualifying persons, and they are tested on their nexus with the country in which they are resident and with the substance. So for businesses, it's relevant that they need to have a real active business with people and assets active in that country. There's always the possibility for the competent authorities to give the benefits of the treaty if the taxpayer doesn't fulfill the requirements to be a qualifying person. And there is always the possibility for tax administration to apply a so-called principal purposes test if the taxpayer is a qualifying person under the determinations of the limitation on benefits, But if still the administration is of the opinion that the treaty is being abused, they can apply the principal purpose test and deny the benefits. What we think is rather special in this convention, and which we are very pleased, and I think with which taxpayers can be pleased as well, is that both tax administrations have agreed that if they apply this anti-abuse provision, they will first consult the competent authorities, the tax administration of the other state. That doesn't mean that they need the confirmation or the agreement from the other tax administration, but at least it guarantees that both tax administration are at the same table, can exchange their views on the facts and circumstances, and can together develop a common understanding of what abuse is, because international discussions show that tax administration and officials have different opinions in different parts of the world on that. And then the next slide, please. Some very short words on individuals. Individuals earning benefits from employment, those are taxed in the country. Well, generally, the convention theoretically starts that it's taxed in the state in which the employee is a resident, but practically it almost always means that the employees are taxed in the country in which they work, or in the country where their employer is resident. Second part, capital gains. Main rule is that capital gains are taxable in the country where the earner of the capital gains is a resident. There are some exemptions for some substantial shareholdings in certain companies, and there is obviously, we have a very complicated rule for Dutch immigrants who we give a conservatory assessment when leaving up on the shares that they own and that have increased in value. We collect that when the payments are received. We have guaranteed under the treaty that the Netherlands can continue applying those taxes. Another aspect very important for Dutch Parliament is the pension issues. The Netherlands has a pretty comfortable pension regime in which pensions can be built up at very good conditions. And what we have been confronted in the past is that these pensioners, upon just before retirement, leave the country to receive their pension in a country where the pensions are not taxed or taxed at a lower rate. And to prevent that, we have agreed in the convention that pensions will always be taxable, let's say broadly speaking, in the country where the pension fund that pays out the pensions is resident. Government services, income from government services are obviously only taxable in the state of that government. And finally, there's a special provision on artists, on entertainers and sports persons. They are taxed in the country where they perform their gigs or where they perform their sporting events. It is a bit contradictory to what we agree on employment, but international consensus is that entertainers and sport persons can earn such large sums with a single or a very limited number of appearances that it is found justified to tax that in the country where those activities are performed. That will be it from my side. I hand over, if you could move to the next slide, Laura, I hand over to Paul, who will guide you through the issues concerning business profits. Paul, please.
Yes, thank you, Aart. So you covered a lot of the treaty already, but one important topic remains, which is the taxation of business profits. So this part of the presentation covers the question which country may tax business profits. I'll also discuss the taxation of withholding, the levying of withholding taxes, which are very important for business, but can also be relevant for individuals, but that will also be included in this part of the presentation. To start, the general rule for business profits is that they can be taxed in the country of residence of the entity which earns the profits. But as always, the exceptions to the main rule are the most important ones. And there are some in this treaty. The most important ones are generally in line with other treaties and with the model conventions we use, which is the exception that business profits are taxed in the other country if there's a so-called permanent establishment. And maybe we can move to the next slide, so we'll start immediately with that one. So this is a situation, we have a Dutch company with some activities or employees in Colombia, or the other way around, a Colombian company with some activities in the Netherlands, or people in the Netherlands. And the main rule will be that the profits realized with these activities will be taxable in the Netherlands, but it will be different if there is a so-called permanent establishment in the other country. Definition of a permanent establishment is a fixed place of business through which the business of an enterprise is carried on. So there needs to be a place of business which is fixed both in time and location. But we included also some extensions to that standard definition. The most important ones are that if, in this example, the Dutch company offers or performs services in Colombia, and those services are carried on for a period for 183 days or more, then the services are also considered a permanent establishment. So the taxing rights are also in Colombia in that case. Another extension of the definition of permanent establishment is offshore activities, which are basically almost all activities in the territorial seas of one of the countries. If these activities last for a period of 30 days or more, they are considered a permanent establishment, and the country where these activities are performed may tax the profits realized with these activities. A third important agreement we made is for construction and building sites. Such activities also have a period of 183 days, so half a year, just like for the services. They may not always be a general permanent establishment, so we made a specific agreement that such activities are considered a permanent establishment if they last for that period. Then finally, what is also considered a permanent establishment in this agreement, in this treaty, is the so-called dependent agent, which is a person of the Dutch entity or the Colombian entity in the other country, which has the right to conclude treaties on behalf of that entity, or who plays an important role in the conclusion of such agreements. If there is such a person in the other country, that will also form a permanent establishment. We did include some anti-abuse rules besides the specific anti-abuse rules, which Aart already mentioned in the article. An example thereof is the so-called anti-splitting rule. I mentioned some specific periods with regard to the permanent establishments, for example, the 183-day periods for services. We also agreed in the treaty that you cannot split up contracts to avoid the 183 days. If you have two contracts of only a couple of months, they will be added together in specific circumstances. So this is basically one of the most important exceptions to the main rule that the country of residence may tax. And maybe we can go to the next slide. So this is the slide which deals with dividend income. The main rule, again, is the dividend income may be taxed in the country of residence, so the country which receives the dividends, but we agreed on a limited withholding tax rate for the country from which the dividend is distributed. We agreed on 3 different rates, which is a 0% rate withholding tax rate for pension funds, for distributions to pension funds, a 5% withholding tax limit for dividends paid in intercompany situations, and we have defined that as situations where one company owns at least 20% of the interest in another company. The maximum withholding tax rate is 15% in other cases. With respect to the intercompany dividends, it's relevant to mention that this treaty rate is mostly relevant for distribution by a Colombian entity to a Dutch entity, because for distributions by a Dutch entity, we have domestic law that says if there is a treaty with another country, we will in principle apply a 0% withholding tax rate, unless there is specific anti-abuse legislation. Then maybe one specific issue for this treaty, which is different from other treaties, is that Colombia also taxes on dividend distributions by a permanent establishment, and such distributions also fall under the scope of this article. So they're also limited to the mentioned rates, which will generally be the 5% rate in practice. Then also in this, in specific relation to the intercompany dividends, we included an anti-abuse rule, which states that you need to only 20% interest for at least 365 days in order to qualify for the lower rate. Then maybe we can go to the next slide, which deals with withholding taxes on interest and on royalties. The basic story is the same, but we included agreements on some different rates, of course, and for different situations. So the source country may levy tax, but it's limited to, in the case of interest, in principle 10%, but there are some exceptions for which include lower rates, which is a 5% rate for loans by financial institutions for infrastructure projects in Colombia, and a 0% withholding tax on interest in specific cases, which includes payments to pension funds, to governments, etc. Then finally, the withholding taxes on royalties. We included a standard rate of 10% for royalties, but we included a broad definition of royalties in the treaty, which also includes industrial or scientific equipment. But then we agreed that for such royalty payments, only a withholding tax of 5% is applied. That is, for my part, most important agreements. Those are the most important agreements for business profits. I think we can go to the next slide, which already is the end of our presentation. So we'd like to thank you for your attention. And if there are any questions, please feel free to ask them.
All right. Thank you very much, Paul and Aart, for your elaborate presentation. Again, we're very happy with all the work you've done for the last couple of years on the negotiation, but also on this presentation. And indeed, for all the participants, you can ask your questions that you still may have in the chat, and then we'll go through them here. So the first question would be, let's go take the one from FMO. The question is, what would be the rate for loans from FMO, the Dutch Development Bank?
Let me check whether, I don't know. Well, I think that is a relevant question, and in some treaties we have included a specific,
Yeah, we have included FMO specifically in this treaty, and it's covered by the 0% rate for specific situations.
So it's in the because one should know there is the treaty with all the articles, but there's the protocol to the convention which gives some examples or explication on the treaty. And in the article Roman 11 of the protocol, there is an addition to Article 11 that explains which companies or which taxpayers fall under the definition of paragraph 3 of Article 11 of the treaty. And as Paul said, FMO is one of those taxpayers that has a 0% on withholding tax rate on interest.
All right. Thank you very much. If that would need any further clarification for FMO, FMO can ask the question in the chat. Perhaps let's go to the question of Ray. And maybe I can ask Ray, as he is in the chat as well, to give a bit of context to his question. So, Ray, if you're there, could you kindly ask the question through the microphone to us, please? There's a question that Ray asked about where does the BV pays its profit taxes?
Maybe if you want, if you want, Martijn, I think we can try to answer this question. At least give the approach to these kind of questions. The question says that a Dutch person, well, nationality, citizenship is irrelevant for the treaty, but a Dutch person has a BV, so he owns all the shares in a Dutch organized BV, but manages a company from Colombia. So I assume he means that the Dutch person lives in Colombia, but owns all the shares of a BV in the Netherlands, and he manages that company from Colombia. Well, the first issue to determine is whether the BV for the application of the treaty is indeed or remains a resident of the Netherlands. For Dutch law, there's no doubt that any BV organized under Dutch law is for domestic law is a resident of the Netherlands. But it might be so that the place of effective management of that BV is the place where the director lives, which would be Colombia. In that case, Colombia might say, from our perspective, our national perspective, the place of effective management determines where the BV is a resident, and the Colombian authority might determine that the BV is a resident of Colombia. In that case, we need a tiebreaker to decide of which country the BV is a resident. We have agreed with Colombia that we will do so by mutual agreement procedure, in which we take all the factors into account. And I would say that if it is true that the BV is managed totally from Colombia, the BV would be a resident of Colombia and therefore would pay his taxes in Colombia. If the result of the double residency would be otherwise, the BV would remain resident of the Netherlands. Obviously, the BV pays taxes in the Netherlands, despite of the fact that its shareholder and director is living in Colombia. And then the additional question is where the Dutch manager pays his income taxes. It slightly depends on what his function in the organization is. If he is just an employee of the Dutch company, he will be taxed in the country generally where he works, if that work is, or where his income is paid from. But there is a special provision in Article 16, I think it is, on directors, and there, no, it is 15. So directors from companies are taxed in the country, members of the board of directors are taxed in the country where the company of which they are director is taxed. So that would be the Netherlands if the BV remains a resident of the Netherlands.
Okay, thank you, Aart. That makes sense. We have a question here that's in a different chat from Ruben. Is there a most favored nation clause in this agreement? And if so, how would this apply?
Yes, shall I cover that? Yeah, yes, there is a very specific most favored nation clause in this treaty. So as I mentioned during the presentation, we agreed on that the provision of services can be a permanent establishment. And we included that will be the case if these services are carried on for a period of 183 days or more. The Colombian delegates preferred a lower threshold of a fewer number of days. So we agreed in the protocol to the treaty that if we agree on a tax treaty with another country, which includes a lower threshold than 183 days, in that case, that lower threshold will also apply to this treaty. So it may be the case that in the future, the number of days I mentioned will be decreased if we conclude another treaty which has a lower number of days. So there is a very specific most favored nation clause in this treaty.
And if I may add, Paul, I think there's another very, very specific one, and that is where it comes to the limitation on benefits provision. The Colombian delegation was pretty harsh, we found, on the conditions for that one. We accepted it, but we have said to the Colombian, if you, after signing of this convention, agree with another state, a more benign anti-abuse provision, then that will also apply to the Convention of the Netherlands, and that can be found in Article Roman 15 of the protocol.
Thank you very much. Another question is from Marta Nino, asking about air international transport. Does the treatment include international air transport?
We included a specific article on international transport, which is in Article 8, which is about shipping and air transport. And the rule there is that profits of the rule is in line with the model conventions that are issued. That profits of an enterprise of a contracting state shall be taxable only in that state. So it will be in the state of the enterprise that is carrying out the air transport activities.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, to all participants, if you need any further clarification, just ask the question in the chat. Or if the question really needs some context, we could even give you the microphone, of course. Then a question from
maybe Martijn.
Yeah, sure.
Martijn, if you allow us, maybe on international transportation, we have a rule that determines where the business profits of an international transportation company will be taxed. As Paul said, that would be the place of residence of the company. But there's also an issue with the employees, because obviously employees of an air transportation company perform their employment worldwide. So there is always a discussion where to tax that income. And with Colombia, we have agreed that they are only taxable in the country in which the employee is a resident.
Thank you for the clarification, Aart. Then we have a question from Sander Daniels, also from FMO, I believe, about the definition of infrastructure projects. He says, I assume it applies to a certain law. Are renewable energy projects included?
That definition will be mainly determined by Colombian administration. They informed us that it is a broad definition, but we don't know the specifics of the definition. So I can't tell you right now whether the energy projects will be included.
But if the question comes from FMO, they will be covered by another provision in any instance. So for FMO specifically, this doesn't seem to be the most relevant question, is it? If they are covered by the 0% under the protocol,
I think so, yeah.
On any loan.
Yeah.
And I've seen some questions. If I might jump in, Martijn, we've seen some questions on the Caribbean islands and Aruba. As we said in the introduction, the convention does not apply to residents of or taxes levied in the Caribbean part of the Netherlands. So residents from those islands will have to do with the domestic law of both countries and the provisions in the domestic law to avoid double taxation. The convention does not apply to them.
Thank you. Then there's a question from Pablo saying, I am Colombian and own 25% of a BV in Holland. I work from Colombia and provide services to other Latin countries. I'm also the director. Can I charge my work as services?
Well, I think Miriam already did a very good attempt to answer that question. But seriously, I think these kind of questions are really up to the tax administration in both countries. The determination of profits and the determination of whether payments are deductible is to the tax administrations. The convention comes into play when there is double taxation, and there is no indication that would happen in this case described by Pablo. And the other question, Martijn, we've seen one or two questions about where the final texts can be found. We will send you a link where the treaty text, with the treaty text, where it can be found, and then you can distribute that to your members if you wish.
Thank you. So the text is already available, or it will be available after ratifying by Parliament?
No, the text has become public after signature.
Good. Thank you. We wait to see if there are any more questions. I think we've covered all the questions that are in the chat now. And I don't see anybody typing. So I think if there are no more questions, I can thank you, Aart and Paul, for this session. We're very happy with your answers.
Okay, would you allow me?
Sure. Ambassador.
Well, first of all, I also would like to thank Aart and Paul for their explanations, and I really hope that your optimism about the ratification will become a reality, because indeed companies are extremely eager for the treaty to come in effect, and of course it takes two to tango. We have to wait not only on the Dutch side but also the Colombian side, and of course we have elections and a new parliament being installed in the summer. But rest assured that we will do also our utmost to speed up the process on this side as far as we can do this, of course. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. And again, a warm thank you to the Dutch Ministry of Finance. And thank you also very much to all participants to this session. I hope it was useful to you. Again, we'll provide the text and we'll have some more information on our Facebook page as well soon. So make sure to like our social media page of the Dutch Embassy. And with that, we close the webinar of the tax treaty, and the Holland House members will now go on with their General Assembly. And I give the microphone to Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todas las personas que nos acompañaron en esta mañana y en esta tarde también en Holanda. Les queremos pedir a las personas y a las empresas que no hacen parte de miembros de Holland House Colombia que por favor se retiren de este evento porque vamos a dar inicio a la Asamblea de Afiliados Holland House 2022.